me. You're more than a little bit frustrated with your own political party, the one that you identify with. You say, I'm a conservative first, a Republican second, and frankly, I think the Republicans are dropping the ball when it comes to spending on Capitol Hill. They're going for deals that will keep the government in operation, but we're not gaining any ground when it comes to fighting against a rapidly rising tide of debt. $34 trillion and counting. Joe Biden plans to add about $2 trillion to our debt this year through the $2 trillion deficit, which is double the size of the deficit last year. So I thought we'd talk about that with Brandon Arnold, who's Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Brandon, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Lars.
What's happening on Capitol Hill, and why aren't we getting something done? I realize we only have one house of the two houses, and we don't have the presidency, but you'd think Republicans could accomplish something to hold this rising tide of spending back.
Well, we have a lot of problems going on Capitol Hill right now, and that's going to shock absolutely nobody.
Exactly.
But I think the biggest one is the fact that Republicans can't act in a unified fashion. I'm speaking primarily of House Republicans. They squabble over absolutely everything. And if they don't act in a unified fashion, then it has a huge impact on the negotiations. Speaker Johnson cannot go into a room with Chuck Schumer and expect to negotiate a solid deal if Schumer knows that when he brings that back to his conference on the House side, that he's not going to be able to get it passed. So the first thing Republicans need to do is set their priorities so that he has some leverage in those conversations.
Because when individual Republicans, I think there's a group of 14 right now that are objecting to the current deal, but they're wanting not just to hold back the increased spending, but a bunch of other issues that they see as important, and probably I see as important too. So how do we make that happen, both a unified front when it comes to spending, but still allowing, Republicans strongly about certain issues to say thing? Well, because they see the budget negotiations as their opportunity to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a leverage point, but the first thing you have to do is prioritize what you want. Is that the border? Is that a reduction in spending? Is that starting to use the spending, the appropriations process, I should say, to roll back portions of Bidenomics, which I think is incredibly important? You're not going to get everything. You have to be a little bit realistic when you go into these conversations because you are talking about a narrow majority in the House, whereas the Senate is controlled by Democrats, and the White House obviously is Joe Biden. And you're talking about ripping into his agenda, which absolutely needs to be done, but we're not going to be able to eviscerate it. We can score some strategic victories. We can help American businesses, American taxpayers, the broad economy here, but we can't do it all in one fell swoop. So if we approach this thinking that we're going to get everything that we want, then we're going to be deeply disappointed.
Yeah, I get that point too. When you say, well, is our current spending an existential threat to the United States? I believe it is. So solve that one. Oh, but the border is also an existential threat to the United States. Okay, we need to get that one too. And then the possibility of getting into, say, a shooting war with, say, with the Chinese, that's another existential threat to the United States. Even if you only take the big ones, you got to get at least those three, don't you?
Well, I would be very impressed and satisfied if we were able to get three victories of that magnitude. I just don't think that's realistic. Unfortunately, what's happened over the past several presidencies, Republican and Democratic alike, is that we've ceded more and more authority to the executive branch. Congress has become less and less influential when it comes not just to foreign policy, which is traditionally been the territory of the president, but certainly the border and immigration, but even decisions that are made by federal agencies have become extremely powerful as Congress has become, sorry to use a pejorative here, but they've become lazy. They've sourced out all of these functions, these legislative functions, to the federal bureaucracy controlled by the president. And now we need to rein it in. We need to rein it in whether Biden's president or whether a Republican is president. But it needs to start here. And as that happens, then you'll have fewer targets that you need to fire at during these types of proceedings. But until we do that, we have the FTC running amok. We have the IRS running amok, the Department of Labor. The list goes on and on. And those are victories that need to be Well, they at least need to be on our list of priorities as we go into these negotiations. We're not going to get all of these victories.
I'm talking to Brandon Arnold, who's Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Is the Chevron case, or the case that will affect the Chevron doctrine just heard by the Supreme Court yesterday, is that part of it? Because if that case slaps back at the deep state, do not have the authority that you've been pretending to have for the last 40 years, but we may not hear about that till June. But is that a piece of getting this solved?
That's a piece of it. That's a huge piece of it. It's not the only piece. I think it needs to also happen through the legislative process. Just the function of writing bills in a manner that is more prescriptive, that gives less wiggle room to the administration, I think would go a long way to addressing this issue. But even when they do that, it's not sufficient because the administration, as you say, has become so, it's become such an entity of its own that you see even calling back these un-COVID dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars going out the door to state and local governments. They haven't spent over $100 billion of these dollars. That should be brought back to the U.S. Treasury, right? If you can't spend it in this window, forget about it. We have a huge debt. But they're trying to use every little bit of wiggle room that they can to get to allow the states and local governments to keep these funds. We don't have the votes to pass.
But hold on, one thing in particular, Brandon, when you say they, the left wants to do that. I don't know of any conservatives who say we want to leave all these dollars with the states and the counties where we sent them out, supposedly to meet an emergency. The emergency now being over, give the excess funds back. The left wants it out there because I think they expect to be able to use those dollars politically. I don't see any evidence the conservatives are taking that same approach. Do you?
No, I agree with you there, and that's a good clarification. I appreciate that. But yeah, it's a big fight where conservatives are having to stand up and say, listen, we pushed way too much money out the door in the first place. But if you haven't spent it at this point, this money needs to come back. They are mincing words and saying, well, technically we have until the end of this year to spend the money, but as long as we make a commitment to spend the money in the future, these dollars can be carried forward in perpetuity, essentially, which is just ludicrous. But until you start to rein those agencies in and specifically prohibit that type of shenanigans, it's just going to get worse and worse.
It's funny, Brandon, I've spent my whole life in the private sector. I could never imagine that in the private sector. When I worked, they would occasionally, if we had to travel, especially a long ways away, like Russia one time, they'll advance you some money. But if you come home from the assignment and you say, gee, I only spent half the money you gave me, but I think I'll hang on to it and I'll see if I can find something to spend it on in the next year or two, nobody in the private sector would tolerate that garbage, would they?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, the federal government operates on a completely different set of rules and standards, and they're always right until proven wrong. It's incredibly costly and difficult. You see them go after businesses left and right, trying to block mergers and acquisitions, trying to regulate businesses, stop them from what they're doing. And you have to stop and take the federal government to court. They have no problem spending taxpayer dollars to drag you into court or be dragged into court to fight these protracted battles. But meanwhile, the private businesses that are affected are going bankrupt. They're unable to actually provide the goods and services that they're selling. Yeah, and the playing field is tilted so heavily in the favor of the federal government. It's unlike any other entity that we deal with, certainly not like anything in the private sector.
It almost makes you think that maybe the government is there for us to serve them and not for them to serve us. Brandon, thank you very much. That's Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Me.